Welcome to the House of Hypertrophy. Are you missing out on gains if you're not training the overhead press? Some say lateral raises are overrated and that overhead presses hit the side delts just as well, while others go so far as to call overhead presses a waste of time. We'll use the literature to examine how different overhead press variations could compare to one another for growing the delts, triceps, and upper pecs. Then we'll see how overhead presses could compare to other exercises. Let's dive in. The overhead press can be performed in different planes. No, I'm not talking about that kind of plane, but rather planes of motion. Overhead pressing can be performed in the frontal or sagittal plane. There are differences between them that likely influence how much the different heads of the shoulders are trained. Focusing on the frontal plane, this involves pressing with your arms out by your sides, which happens when using a wider grip on the barbell, using the behind the neck variation, having the dumbbells on either side of your head, and with machines that have handles out to the sides. If your upper arms are not aligned with your head, but rather a little more in front, which tends to be the case with some machines and using the front barbell overhead press, you're not exactly in the frontal plane. Rather, you're in what we call the scapular plane, but both have similarities. The motion occurring at the shoulder in both planes is what we can generally call shoulder abduction. We can see that in both planes, the side delts have great leverage throughout the range of motion. The front delts also have respectable leverage, especially over 100 degrees of abduction where it matches and possibly surpasses the side delts leverage. The rear delts are not as effective as an abductor as the front and side delts, and sometimes may actually function as a shoulder adductor. Note that leverage here refers to a muscle's moment arm, which is the perpendicular distance between the line of force of a muscle and the center of the joint it's moving. There's evidence that a muscle's moment arm relates to how much it's activated in a movement. In the spirit of scientific accuracy, there is debate about how useful the leverage literature is for inferring muscle growth, but know that I do think it's useful in many cases. More details and justifications for how I've used it in this video can be found in the pinned comment. There are two factors that go some way to slightly enhancing front delt involvement. Firstly, overhead presses have us externally rotated. There is evidence that external rotation increases the front delt's leverage for abduction, while the side and rear delt's leverage is minimally influenced by external rotation. Secondly, overhead presses tend to be quite challenging at higher shoulder angles, where the front delt's leverage proportionally becomes a lot better. When comparing these different variations, some argue that more stability provided by machines enables greater mechanical tension. It also tends to be why some recommend seated versus standing overhead presses. However, the evidence used to suggest that greater stability equals more tension, in my view, does not apply to typical resistance training exercises for hypertrophy. We also have evidence in trained individuals finding that seated barbell overhead presses did not elicit greater delt activity than the standing variation. Others argue barbells and dumbbells are better due to eliciting transient elevations in anabolic hormones. However, the overall literature fails to show that temporary elevations in anabolic hormones relate to actual growth. All in all, we generally see that provided you're training to or close to failure, all modalities are capable of producing similar growth. So it comes down to preference and convenience. Some may prefer the freedom of dumbbells, or you may enjoy the greater stability provided by seated and/or machine variations. Now, dumbbell and some machine variations allow us to bring our hands together at the top, but the available literature suggests reaching shorter muscle lengths often fails to confer additional growth benefits. That said, there is another slight movement difference worth noting. This paper fascinatingly found that the side delts were a little more activated during behind the neck barbell overhead pressing compared to front barbell overhead pressing, while front delt activity wasn't that different. Summoning the spirit of scientific accuracy once again, electromyographic research is also controversial, and long-time viewers will know I'm critical of it. There are clearly cases where EMG data fails to predict muscle growth, but there are other cases where it does correlate with growth. A more thorough explanation and justification for why and how I've used it throughout this video can be found in the pinned comment. There is a plausible explanation behind these results. Although we noted there are similarities between the frontal and scapular planes, we do tend to see the side delts having relatively a little more leverage than the front delts in the frontal plane, and we have some evidence finding a little greater side delt activity when abducting in the frontal versus scapular plane. Thus, moving in the frontal plane, which the behind the neck and even dumbbell variations permit, could possibly be a little better for the side delts. Some may be wondering though, aren't behind the neck presses dangerous? There is some evidence that people reference to support this, but there is importantly this paper that reported, for participants with normal trunk stability and ideal shoulder range of motion, overhead pressing is a safe exercise for the shoulder and spine when performed either in front of or behind the head. Ultimately, I would use your judgment. If you find them too uncomfortable, that's okay. The dumbbell variation or just sticking to the scapular plane are still solid options. Overhead presses in the sagittal plane have us press with our arms in front of our body, which happens when using a narrow grip with the barbell and moving the dumbbell in this way. Here, instead of performing abduction, we're performing shoulder flexion. Once again, the rear delts are minimally involved here. The side delts do have some leverage for shoulder flexion, but it's clear the front delts have far greater leverage. Thus, if you're trying to maximize front delt involvement while minimizing side delt involvement, this variation likely best achieves this. Summarizing this section, both sagittal and frontal or scapular plane overhead presses are likely great for the front delts. Frontal plane variations may better train the side delts, while sagittal plane variations probably train the front delts a little better. All overhead presses involve elbow extension, which is carried out by the triceps. But how effective are overhead presses for triceps hypertrophy? First off, it's likely the long head of the triceps isn't trained well with any overhead press variation. This is because the long head crosses the shoulder and is involved in shoulder extension and shoulder adduction, which are the opposite shoulder movements that take place in overhead presses. So, a strong contraction of the long triceps head during any overhead press would partially fight against us lifting the load. Similar logic extends to the bench press. If the triceps long head strongly contracted during the lifting part of a bench press, it would produce shoulder extension that would fight against the shoulder flexion needed to lift the weight. Indeed, we have direct evidence finding minimal long triceps head hypertrophy from the bench press. However, the medial and especially lateral heads grew quite well. The lateral head actually grew more with the bench press than it did with tricep skull crushers, while medial head growth wasn't quite as much with the bench press. I expect this probably applies to overhead presses. They likely effectively develop the lateral and medial heads. Indeed, this paper found lateral head triceps activity was fairly high across barbell and machine overhead presses, including the behind and front variations. This paper found medial head activity remained constant across 5 different bench press incline angles. A complete upright position that's involved in the overhead press wasn't tested, but I can't think of a strong reason as to why it would be lower. A point worth mentioning is that it's possible sagittal plane variations elicit slightly greater triceps activity than frontal or scapular plane variations, but there's unfortunately no study I'm aware of exploring this. Another worthy point is there are 2 papers fascinatingly finding that when in the frontal or scapular plane, the dumbbell overhead press produces lower triceps activity than the barbell overhead press. This might be related to the fact that with dumbbells, your capacity to produce lateral forces is lower. Note that sagittal plane dumbbell overhead presses likely do train the triceps well. This only applies to the dumbbell variation in the frontal or scapular planes. As mentioned in our guide to developing the chest, the incline bench press is likely one of the best ways to train the upper pecs. We have this paper finding upper pec activity was maximized at a 30-degree incline angle, while higher angles which effectively get us closer to overhead positions result in lower upper pec activity but greater front delt activity. The upper pecs do not appear to have much leverage for shoulder abduction, which we know occurs with frontal and scapular plane variations. Therefore, although the upper pecs may be involved a bit with overhead presses, it won't be much. That said, the upper pecs do have decent leverage for shoulder flexion, so it's possible that sagittal plane overhead presses target the upper pecs a little more, but I think it's very likely the growth seen from this is still far off what's achieved with incline bench pressing. There is a case to be made that overhead presses are up there as the best front delt builders. We've seen data indicating that as your body progressively becomes more upright with a press, all regions of the chest become less involved while the front delts become more involved. So, it's unsurprising that we see even scapular plane overhead presses producing greater front delt activity than the bench press. We even have data suggesting greater front delt activity with dumbbell overhead presses compared to dips, though this particular paper has shortcomings. Some may be wondering, high incline pressing and dips can attain a greater stretch of the front delts than all these overhead presses. Does it matter? I've alluded to this recently. As more research comes out, it's apparent that long lengths may build more muscle in some cases, but not others. This is one case where I'm generally skeptical if reaching or challenging longer muscle lengths is better. This is why my conclusion is overhead presses are some of the best front delt builders. We've seen that scapular plane and especially frontal plane overhead presses likely train the side delts well, but how do they compare to lateral raises? Interestingly, there was this paper that found no significant differences in side delt activity between a front barbell overhead press and a dumbbell lateral raise. This paper was behind some claims that lateral raises are overrated and that overhead presses are enough. However, there was another paper finding better side delt activity with both dumbbell and cable lateral raises compared to overhead presses. Also, when considering the fact that overhead presses involve external rotation and are highly challenging at elevated angles, which are both factors that tend to enhance front delt involvement, I think it's most reasonable to conclude lateral raises are better for the side delts, but overhead presses are still respectable. Overhead presses do not achieve anything that can't be done with other exercises, so it's certainly not essential. The combination of front raises with horizontal pressing, incline pressing, or even dips will be great for the front delts. Lateral raises deliver a better stimulus to the side delts, and there's no shortage of options on the table for growing the triceps. But the overhead press is efficient. You get a great stimulus to all these muscles in one movement, so it is certainly not what I'd call a waste of time. When it comes to constructing a training program, we aren't restricted to selecting one exercise per muscle group, so it's absolutely possible for the overhead press to be part of a well-rounded and highly effective program. We've just focused on pure muscle growth in this video, but your reasons for them may go beyond this, whether you just want to get as strong as possible by pushing weight overhead or you just find it fun. Considering the conflicting information across the web, things can get pretty confusing about how you may want to train. I hope the videos at the House of Hypertrophy go some way to clearing up this confusion, but our high-quality partner, the Alpha Progression app, may also assist you. An extremely well-designed plan generator can help you generate an evidence-based muscle-building program 100% tailored to your needs. This can take you less than the time you take to brush your teeth. There are over a quadrillion input combinations on which your plan is based, and you can still personalize things. During workouts, the app analyzes your performance and suggests how you may progress to sustain muscle gains. Graphs display your long-term progress, and there's a huge exercise database of some of the best muscle building movements with simple video and text instructions. Try out all the premium features free for 2 weeks with a link in the description and comments. And if you like it and choose to go beyond, the link gives you 20% off a subscription. Thank you for making it to the end. Feel free to check out another one of the videos at the House of Hypertrophy.